Okay, good morning, everyone. We are switching gears this morning. We have finished our discussion about the admittedly brief history of evolutionary robotics, and we're moving on to a new module in the course, Open Challenges in Evolutionary Robotics. Since the field is so young, there are a number of questions about how to go about appropriately evolving and automatically designing autonomous machines that still don't have good answers to them. As I mentioned at the beginning of the course, I hope some of you enter the field as well, and maybe some of you will find good answers to some of these open problems or open challenges. We're going to spend two lectures, Lecture 13 and Lecture 14, looking at a conceptual issue in the field, which is how to map genotypes onto good phenotypes. What do we mean by that? We haven't really talked about this too much yet. Just to refresh your memory, the genotype is the data structure that encodes the blueprint of the robot and or its neural controller. In the previous lecture, bipedal locomotion, we just looked at a genotype, which was a vector that contained 12 numbers specifying aspects of the robot's body, and a whole bunch of other numbers specifying the synaptic weights of its neural controller. Turns out that there's lots of different ways to turn genotypes into phenotypes, and a lot of those ways, and the phenotype is, of course, the robot's body and how it moves, form and function. That's phenotype. There's a lot of different ways to transform genotype into phenotype, and some are better than others. Throughout this course so far, we've been looking at sort of the most basic, direct way to turn genotype into phenotype. We take every single number and use that to set some parameter of the robot's body or brain. Not so much in Lecture 13, but in Lecture 14, we're going to start to look at some more complicated ways of taking the genetic information stored in the robot and turning it into the robot itself, and how that can go wrong and how to make it better with an algorithm that's quite famous in our field that's called the NEAT algorithm. In Lecture 13, we're going to look at sort of a subset of the genotype to phenotype mapping problem, which is that usually when we take genetic information and turn it into the synaptic weights of a robot, that neural network is very non-modular, meaning that the synaptic weights are all non-zero, and all of the information from every sensor goes to every motor or every hidden neuron, and all the information in every hidden neuron goes to every motor neuron. So any incoming information to the robot quickly spreads everywhere throughout the brain of the robot. As we've seen in many of these neural controllers, most brains for our robot, every neuron is almost connected to every other neuron. And even if not every neuron is connected to every other neuron, information sort of bleeds throughout the brain of the robot. And it's very hard for it to divide and conquer, to break up problems into subproblems in its head and then execute accordingly. That's known as the lack of modularity problem. And we're going to look at one solution to this in the field, which is to allow evolution to make more modular brains. So in starting Lecture 13 today, we're going to talk about modularity first, and then modularity as it relates to robots. Modularity is, of course, a very important concept in many, many fields. It pops up in different places. Because it's such a general and important idea, it's got different definitions in different fields, but the underlying idea of modularity in all of those fields is the same. We've got some machine, or in our case, a neural network, and we want to see tighter coupling within modules and less coupling across modules. An obvious example of this is any complicated physical machine, like a car. If you open up the hood, there are modules. There's an engine, there are the brakes, there's the battery, there's the windshield system, and so on. By making a car in a modular fashion, you can obviously replace or fix one part of the car without disrupting all the rest of the car. One part can start to wear out or break down. That doesn't necessarily cause the car to break as a whole. It seems so obvious that we would build that way that often we don't even realize that modularity is important, and that it's very easy in some cases to start to make machines that aren't modular. Imagine a car where if you get a small scrape on the windshield, the entire car breaks. Not an ideal way to do things. Another obvious example of modularity is object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming was invented to make it easier for coders to create modular code. So a module in object-oriented programming is obviously often referred to as an object. And the reason why we try and get better at object-oriented programming is the same reason as for the car. We want to make sure that if we fix or modify one small part of the code within one module, that doesn't necessarily break all the other parts of the system. So in any modular system, a well-written modular piece of code or a car, change or removal of a module has relatively little effect on overall performance, except of course if it plays a critical role. If something goes wrong with your engine while you're riding a car, you're out of luck. Okay, so again, just to reinforce this idea, if you're comfortable with object-oriented programming, you can skip over this slide, but for those that are still learning about object-oriented programming, it's worth reinforcing this idea of modularity. In good object-oriented programming, we try and hide the internal complexity of an object or a class from the other objects or classes that call its functions. So I'm going to skip over pyrosim shape here for a moment. You're in the process of modularizing your code, or you've recently done it. Here's one way you could do it. You could create a class called robot, and inside that class robot, there are three functions that other objects, other modules can call: create, draw, and delete the robot. Now, as you all know by heart, there's a lot of internal complexity to a robot. It's got a neural network controller. We have to define aspects of its bodies, its joints. We need to tell the robot how to move, how to sense, and so on. But from something like an evolutionary algorithm that's just calling a simulation to create and draw and delete that robot, it might not, that other piece of code or that other module doesn't necessarily need to know about all this internal complexity. We want to hide it from there. So if you want to make a change to the robot, you can make it in here, and you don't need to make a change in the evolutionary algorithm or the fitness function. You can divide and conquer. Okay, so as we start to consider modularity in robotics and in evolutionary robotics in particular, we need to pay attention to two different kinds of modularity. Modularity in general is useful, but when it comes to neural networks that control robots, there's two kinds of modularity we can build into or look for in a neural network. The first one, and the most obvious one, is structural modularity. And to motivate the description of structural modularity, let's have a look at a figure we've looked at before. This is a figure from the experiment where there was a small humanoid robot that was shaking the block left and right, and then up and down and forward and backwards and so on. In that case, that robot had a whole bunch of little motor primitives: left, right, up, down, and so on. And in this figure, just to remind you, you can think of these little colored squiggles as the actions of the motor neurons that produce that little motor primitive. So green is left, right, red is up, down, blue is forward and back, and so on. The investigators could have created a structurally modular network in which they made little bunches of neurons connected together that would produce left-right motion of the robot. Then they could have created a separate little neural module where they made a subset of neurons and wired them all up that together would produce up-down motion and so on. And they might have included little or no synapses connecting these little neural modules together. The robot could dream up in its head these different ways of moving. And then we could imagine a fourth and final neural module, another little collection of neurons that would turn on or off this gate selection module that would turn on and off which of these little ideas in the robot's head were allowed to grab onto the neurons, and the robot would actually execute what it was thinking about. This idea also relates back to the subsumption architecture that we talked about at the beginning of the course, and that's inside a Roomba if you have one. So that's structural modularity. We've got a whole bunch of neurons, but some subsets of neurons are wired up tightly together, and there are little to no connections between those neural modules. That's structural modularity. If you don't have structural modularity, if you have a neural network in which every neuron is wired up with a synapse to every other neuron, then as the number of neurons n grows, the number of synaptic connections grows quadratically, grows as a function of n squared. Every neuron has to be wired up to every other neuron, including itself. So lack of modularity, lack of structural modularity is problematic because as the robot becomes more complicated and its neural network controller has more and more neurons in it, the number of synapses grows incredibly. And an evolutionary algorithm is going to have to find a way to set all of those weights correctly. And the more synapses there are, the harder it is for evolution to do this. There's a second type of modularity, which we saw actually when we talked about this humanoid robot, which is functional modularity. In this case, we might not necessarily have a network that's structurally modular. So here's my little cartoon of a neural network down here that is not structurally modular. You don't really see tightly interconnected neural modules. Every neuron is more or less connected to the same other subset of a bunch of other neurons. It's kind of a mess. However, this network, as we saw, the neurons that can change their values quickly, that have low time constants, can be pushed by the slow neurons, the neurons that have high magnitude time constants. These purple neurons change their values slowly over time. These slow neurons can push the fast neurons into different discrete patterns. The red pattern, then if the purple pattern, the purple neurons, the slow ones can push these fast neurons into the green pattern, and then if the purple neurons change their value, they push the fast neurons out of the green pattern and into the red pattern, and so on. So we get functional modules. It's the same neurons, but they're producing different discrete patterns at different points in time. That's functional modularity. In this particular lecture, we are not going to talk about functional modularity. We're going to focus mostly on structural modularity, but it's important to keep this distinction in mind. Okay, so how does modularity or lack of modularity, why is this a problem for evolutionary robotics? So again, we probably don't want to have a robot in which every neuron is attached to every other neuron. It's difficult, and we would also like the robot's behavior itself to be modular. We would like to break the task for the robot down into several subtasks, like we just saw here, into several motor primitives, and maybe we would like to assign a subnetwork to each task. In the humanoid robot experiment, we saw the investigators wanted to avoid this idea, but for our purposes, let's keep things simple. There's k different things we want, the k different subtasks we want the robot to do, and we want to create k different neural modules that allow the robot to achieve those subtasks. And if the robot is able to juggle these k different subtasks and execute them in the right place at the right time, the robot will end up performing whatever the overall task is that we want it to perform correctly. Yeah. Sometimes that's a better way to go than just sort of create a fitness function that selects for a very complicated task without breaking it down into subtasks and hope for the best. The robot or the evolutionary algorithm is often not able to evolve that competency for the robot because its neural network controller is non-modular. Every neuron's wired up to everything else, and the robot has a very hard time breaking tasks down into subtasks. So we could ask the roboticist before evolving the robot to actually do this, try and break the task down into several subtasks. There's problems with that. So alternatively, we could ask the evolutionary algorithm to try and not only evolve synaptic weights for our neural network, but also to cut the network into pieces, actually discover a good way to modularize the neural network controller of the robot to make it easier for that evolved robot to execute these subtasks independently. Okay. However, thinking about thinking is misleading. The roboticist and the robot may have different ideas about what counts as a behavior and ways to break down the problem. So, again, this idea of thinking of misleading, it's got lots of different reasons. Here's one of them, which is when we look at or we think about a hypothetical robot that we want to solve a particular problem, we are actually looking either literally or in our head at the robot from a distance. This is called the distal perspective of behavior. We're thinking about what the robot's behavior is or what it should be from a distance. And we actually saw this idea when we first talked about Bratenberg vehicles. When we looked at that first simple Bratenberg vehicle that had one sensor, one motor, and one wire, and it was moving faster or slower through warm or cold water, Bratenberg told us that when we look at that robot from a distance, we might say that it's alive. It looks like it's thinking about, or it feels cold, and so on. Things start to go wrong when we start to reason about a machine or even an organism from a distance. Just to reinforce that idea, imagine this very simple robot here, 2 wheels and 5 proximity sensors emanating out from the front of the robot. And at one point in time, we as a distant observer see the robot drive past a cylinder. And at another point in time, we see exactly the same robot drive past this cube here, this block. We might say, there's the robot driving past a cylinder, and there's a robot driving past the block. Those two English sentences, those descriptions of the robot's behavior, are different, which might lead us erroneously to think that the robot is experiencing two different things in those two different situations. You can see from the way that I've drawn this cartoon that from the robot's perspective, what it feels at these two different points in time is identical. The 5 numbers arriving at the 5 sensor neurons have exactly the same 5 values. The lengths of these proximity sensor beams are the same, and you can see that down here. So from the proximal perspective, proximal meaning close by, so literally in the robot's shoes, seeing the world through the robot's eyes or through its sensors, these two situations are identical. So if we start to think about these two things as different situations, that might lead us to break the tasks down into deal with the cylinder and deal with the block. At least in this simple example, at these two frozen instances of time, the robot cannot deal with the cylinder and the block differently because the robot considers itself to be in an identical situation in these two cases. So it might be that what we think of as roboticists is a good way to break down a problem into manageable parts and create neural modules for the robot to deal with those different subtasks is not an appropriate way for the evolutionary algorithm to break down the task in front of the robot into submodules and allow the robot to solve it. Okay, so we're going to look at actually an old experiment. We're going back towards the beginning of evolutionary robotics. This was in about the mid-90s this experiment was conducted. The researchers asked the following question: how do we enable an evolutionary algorithm to autonomously discover neural modules appropriate to the task? They're going to set the robot a relatively complicated task, which is to pick up all the objects inside an arena, move towards the wall of an arena, and drop those objects off over the wall of the arena. That's a pretty complicated task, especially for a little simple Kepera hockey puck type robot down here. So they're going to create an evolutionary algorithm and a particular type of neural network in which the evolutionary algorithm can easily cleave this neural network into different parts, and those different parts can control the robot's motors to solve this task. Okay, so remember that we're in this module of this course in which we're talking about open challenges. The challenge here again is evolution tends to make non-modular neural networks. Everything tends to be wired up with everything else. The solution here is to create or evolve particular kinds of neural networks to give evolutionary algorithm an option to create modular neural networks. Okay, so in this case, our robot has 7 sensors. There are 6 infrared sensors. So again, it's able to detect things nearby on its left side, front side, and right side with these 6 numbers. And it's got a 7th little laser inside between the 2 pincers of its gripper here. And this is going to be our light barrier sensor. When the robot goes to pick up an object in its environment, like a sugar cube, for example, that object is going to pass between the 2 pincers and break the laser beam. And that number is going to be sent into the 7th sensor neuron. The robot is going to be equipped with 4 motor neurons. One motor neuron controls the left motor. The other motor neuron controls the right motor neuron. The third motor neuron, this is a little bit different from what we've seen before. The third motor neuron is going to trigger a preset motor primitive, which is object pickup. When the third motor neuron fires, when it obtains a non-zero value, the Kepra is going to do this. When the fourth motor neuron obtains a non-zero value, the robot is going to do this. When the third and the fourth motor neuron are quiet, they're zero or near quiet, the robot is neither trying to pick up or release. So this is a little bit different from something we've seen before. The first two motor neurons are controlling the wheels, the speed of the wheels, as we've seen before. Third and fourth motor neurons trigger 2 different kinds of motor primitives. Okay, so let's think about the task. Basically clean up the arena. Pick up all the objects and drop them over the wall and out of the arena. I want you to think for a moment about the way you might divide and conquer this task. If we placed you in a big arena and you had a bunch of jobs to do, you might, for example, break down what you need to do into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different behavioral modules. The first one might be move around and avoid walls. Let's imagine that you're doing this task in pitch blackness, so you got to sort of move around and find these objects. If you bump into walls, move away from them. So we could further decompose this first behavioral module into 2 submodules. If none of your sensors in front of you are firing, you're reaching out in the dark with your hands and waving them around. If you don't feel anything, move forward. If you hit something on your left, turn to your right. If you hit something on your right, turn to your left, and so on. What we're describing here is the coward Bratenberg vehicle. So we could imagine sort of the coward controlling this robot so that it moves around and turns away when it bumps into the wall. You can imagine a second behavioral module, which is if you or the robot happens to move in such a way that suddenly there is an object between your 2 hands, or in the case of the robot, it's 2 pincers. Recognize the object and move yourself so that you're ready for pickup. And then trigger your third behavioral module, some part of your brain that coordinates the lifting of the object up over your head. Now that you're holding it, run a fourth behavioral module. This one might be a modified Bratenberg vehicle that causes you to move forward, but not turn away from a wall once you get to one. Sixth behavioral module, when you recognize a wall, position yourself right up so that you're touching the wall with your front. Then the 7th and final behavioral module, drop the object over the wall. Okay, you could imagine creating a robot with 7 different neural modules in it that if any one of those modules is allowed to control the motors, the robot will do that particular behavior. That's one possible way we could decompose the task. You can probably guess from my build up to this that in a moment we're going to see an evolutionary algorithm divide this task into a bunch of subtasks, and they are absolutely not what you might expect. Okay. One of the elegant things about this experiment that I like is that the investigators snuck up on this question about how to evolve robots with modular brains by evolving the robot to perform this task with an incrementally complicated set of neural networks. This is not like the bipedal locomotion lecture we just saw, where they're going to evolve for a while, pause, make a change to the network, and then keep going. They're going to do separate evolutionary runs. They're going to evolve the robot. They're going to evolve robots with these kinds of brains and see how well the robot does at the cleanup task. Then they're going to reset everything and start all over again. They're going to start evolution all over again with robots equipped with these kinds of brains, this kind of cognitive architecture, and evolve the synaptic weights of this cognitive architecture. See how well robots evolve to do the cleanup task when they're armed with brains of type B. Redo it all again, evolve robots with brains of type C and D, and so on. Okay, let's have a look at these 4 different cognitive architectures. Brains of type A are kind of the simplest thing you could possibly imagine. We've got our seven, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sensors down here. 7, right? Yes, 6 infrared sensors and 1 light barrier sensor. 7 sensors, and each one of the 7 sensors is connected by a synapse to one of the 4 motors. So this is a feed-forward network. The synapses are feeding forward from sensors to motors. No hidden neurons. So no ability to remember anything. No nonlinear transformations of sensory information into motor output, and so on. Okay. Next, neural network architecture of type B. They've got the same 7 sensor neurons and the same 4 motor neurons, but they embed 4 hidden neurons between them, connect up every sensor to every hidden neuron, and connect up every hidden neuron to every motor neuron with a synapse. No recurrent connections here. So robots armed with brains of type B can evolve nonlinear transformations of sensation into action, but they cannot remember anything. There are no recurrent connections here. Cognitive architecture C, we've got our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 neurons down here, and our 7 sensor neurons down here, our 4 motor neurons up here, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 hidden neurons like we had in B, but they've been redrawn here. We haven't seen sensor, hidden, and motor neurons drawn like this before. You'll notice that in this case, all of the 7 sensor neurons are connected directly to the motor neurons. So direct influence of sensation on action is possible in this cognitive architecture. These 7 sensor neurons, each one of them also has a synapse that connects it to one of the first 2 hidden neurons. The first 2 hidden neurons have recurrent connections to the 3rd and 4th hidden neuron. So in type C, we've got some recurrent connections within the hidden neurons, which means that the robot has the ability to remember if that's useful for this task. And the 3rd and the 4th hidden neuron have synapses that connect them to back to the 2 hidden neurons. So we've got a recurrent or loops inside of the hidden layer, and the 3rd and the 4th hidden neuron have synapses that connect them to each of the 4 motor neurons. So this is a slightly different wiring diagram to what we've seen before, but basically something we've seen before. Sensor, hidden, and motor neurons, and we've got recurrent connections in case memory is useful. Cognitive architecture D, this is the human investigators' attempt to force modularity on the neural network and thus on the robot's behavior. We've got our 7 sensors down here, and we can see that each of the sensors is connected to one of the 4 motor neurons in motor module A, and the same 7 sensor neurons are connected to each of the 4 motor neurons in motor module B. If you can imagine a robot equipped with this neural network and it's driving around in the arena, all of these 7 numbers are turning on and off and changing as the robot senses changes in its environment. And that is lighting up the 4 neurons in each of the 2 modules differently. In a sense, robots equipped with brain type D are always holding 2 different ideas about what to do. Here in module A, this is the robot thinking, oh, maybe I'll rotate the left wheel like this and the right wheel like this, and I'm not going to pick up and I'm not going to drop. Or maybe I should spin both wheels backwards while I trigger the drop motor primitive. At any point in time, robots equipped with sensor D are able to it's thinking about these two ideas. Which of these 2 ideas, which of these 4 numbers are actually sent to the motors? Again, the human investigators decided what that should be. They decided that when the gripper is empty, these 4 motor neurons grab control of the motors, and when the gripper is full, when the robot is when that light beam is broken, there is either an object between the pincers or the robot is actually holding an object. These 4 motor neurons grab control of the motor. So again, this is kind of like subsumption architecture. The robot is holding multiple ideas in its head simultaneously, and from moment to moment, these 2 different ideas can actually seize control of the robot and make that thought a reality. Okay, so just to review, in neural module A, no modularity, no hidden neurons. Neural brains of type B, we've got hidden neurons, no modularity. Over here, we have memory and hidden neurons in brain C, but no modularity. And in brain type D, there is human-enforced modularity. We're now going to look at brain E, the 5th and final type of cognitive architecture they tried to evolve on their robots. This takes a little bit to digest. So from a high level, this particular cognitive architecture was designed by the human investigators to make it easy for the evolutionary algorithm to cut this neural network in different ways, to basically, if it's helpful, and it may not be, if it's helpful for evolution to evolve modularity or behavioral modularity for this robot, it can do so in a flexible manner. Let's see how this works. Sensor layer looks pretty familiar. We've got our 7 sensor neurons down here, and you'll notice that there are 4 groups of neurons up here. Each group corresponds to one of the 4 actions. Spin the left wheel at some speed, spin the right wheel at some speed, trigger the pickup behavior, or trigger the release behavior. There are 4 neurons assigned to each of those quote-unquote motor neurons, those ultimate actions that the robot performs. Within that group, you can see there are 2 black and 2 white neurons. The white neurons correspond to output neurons. We'll talk about those in a moment. And the 2 black neurons correspond to 2 selector neurons. Okay, so we've got a total of 16 neurons at the output or at the motor layer. If you squint really hard, you should be able to see that each sensor neuron has a synapse connecting to each of the 16 output neurons. So every sensor neuron is connected to each of the 16 output neurons. So if we drop brain type E into the robot and the robot starts to move around, the 7 numbers arriving at the sensor layer are changing, and the values of all 16 output neurons are also changing as a function of whatever these synaptic weights happen to be. Okay, at every moment in time, the code for the robot visits each of these 4 groups, and when it's visiting a particular group, the code looks at the values of the 2 selector neurons. If the value of the first selector neuron is greater than the value of the second selector neuron, so if this value is greater than this value, the value of this output neuron is sent to the left motor. If the value of the right-hand selector neuron is greater than the value of the left-hand selector neuron, then the value of the right-hand output neuron is sent to the left motor. So that's why these pairs are called selector neurons. They select which module, which neural module in here, it takes control of the motor at any time. So there are two different neural modules for each of the four possible motor primitives, the four things that the robot can do. So if we think of the state of the neural network as which selector neuron is allowing control of that particular motor primitive, how many possible states are there? Within each of the four groups, there's four possible states. Either the left part of that group is in control or the right part of that group is in control. So we can imagine assigning a binary value to this group and a binary value 0 or 1 to this group, 0 or 1 to this group, or 0 to 1 at this group at any moment in time as the robot is behaving. And since we have four binary numbers, we can imagine that in this case, the right part of the group is in charge, 1. Left part is in control, 0. Left, 0. Left, 0, for example. So 1, 0, 0, 0. At another point in time, 1 is in control, 0 is in control, 1 is in control, 0 is in control. 1, 0, 1, 0. That's another combination of states inside the brain of the robot. We've got four binary numbers. How many states are there? There are 2 to the 4 possible states for this robot. It's morning here, 2 to the 4, 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 8 times 2 is 16, 2 to the 4, 16 possible states for the robot. These different neural modules can seize control of the motors at any given time. Okay, so again, just to review, they're going to perform 5 sets of experiments. They're going to evolve robots with A brains, robots with B brains, robots with C brains, robots with D brains, and robots with E brains. And then when they compare how well the robot evolves to perform the task across these 5 experiments, they're going to start to learn what is the role in this task of internal units, or internal units or neurons is synonymous with hidden units or hidden neurons. So if hidden neurons are useful for this particular task, which of these experiments should be successful and which ones shouldn't be? I'll give you a moment to think about that. If hidden neurons are useful, then robots equipped with brains A that lack internal units should have a hard time evolving to perform the task, but robots with brains B, C, and D should do a good job at this task. You'll notice that in type E, there actually aren't any internal units. So maybe robots evolved with A brains and E brains wouldn't do well, but robots evolved with B brains, C brains, and not D brains would do well. There are also no internal units in type D. So only B and C would evolve to succeed at the task, and robots with A, D, and E brains would not evolve to do well at this task. If recurrent connections are useful for this task, so maybe memory is useful for this task, you would expect when evolution evolves C brains, the robot should evolve to do better at the task than in any of the other 4 experiments. Finally, if modularity is useful for this task, if it makes sense for the robot to break down the task into subtasks, then robots evolved with A, B, and C brains should evolve to only do so well at the task, but maybe robots evolved with D and or E brains would evolve to do well at this task. Okay, let's look at the actual data. Here we go. They created, as always, for each of these 5 experiments, they created a population of initially random sets of synaptic weights for however many synapses there are in that experiment. Remember, there's 5 experiments. And as you can see, for these 5 different cognitive architectures, there's different numbers of synapses. They then took each one of those sets of synaptic weights in that initial random population, took those synaptic weights, labeled the synapses of that neural controller for the robot, put that robot into the arena, and they allowed the robot to move around for 200 actions. So they did all of this work. 200 actions, you can think of this as 200 time steps in the simulation. They watched what the robot did for 200 time steps or actions, or until the robot actually grabbed an object, took it to the wall, and correctly released it over the far side of the wall. If that happened, they stopped the simulation early. That's what they define as one epoch. They basically give the robot armed with that cognitive architecture and that set of synaptic weights up to 200 time steps to get rid of one of the objects. Okay. That they then took the robot and allowed it to. They moved it to another. If the robot had performed 200 actions or it had correctly released an object, they took that robot and put it to a random place in the arena and allowed it to do the same thing again, another epoch and another epoch, and they did that 15 times. So the robot basically had 15 attempts to try and clean up the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 objects in its environment. So you can think of one simulation or one whole evaluation of one set of synaptic weights as lasting up to 200 times 15 time steps long. After that time, they computed the fitness for that set of synaptic weights, which is how many, if any, of the objects the robot ejected from the arena. They then went to the second set of synaptic weights, the second genotype in the population, labeled the neural controller for the robot for that, and evaluated that neural controller on the robot for 15 epochs, and they kept doing that for each set of synaptic weights in the population. Now they have a fitness value assigned to every set of synaptic weights in that initial random population. Delete the controllers that cause the robot to do a poor job of cleaning up the arena. Make randomly modified copies of the sets of synaptic weights that allow the robot to do a little bit better at cleaning up the arena, and then repeat that process all over again for another generation and another generation and another generation. And they did this for 1,000 generations. So we've got evolutionary time, as always, on the horizontal axis down here. And up here, we have the number of successful epochs. How many of these 200 time step time windows did the robot correctly grab and release an object over the edge of the arena? I mentioned that there are 5 objects in the arena. You can see that some of the evolved controllers actually got scores higher than 5. So they were putting, if a robot did manage to drop an object outside the arena, as that robot was being randomly placed at a new position for the next epoch, they'd take that object and put it back into the arena at some random location. So poor robot, it can never actually clean up the arena. It's just got to keep tossing stuff outside the arena as we keep dropping garbage into its arena. Okay, you'll notice immediately that robots equipped with brains A never evolved to do a very good job. They could get rid of 6 objects, but the robots equipped with the 4 other types of brains did much better. Remember, here's type A here. So this simple neural network controller, or this cognitive architecture, is too simple for this task. Okay, you'll notice that B, C, and D did pretty well. Here's B, C, and D. So hidden neurons probably helps. B did better than A. And the only difference between B and A is hidden neurons. So that's helpful. C did better than A. So having recurrent connections also helps. D did pretty well as well. So human enforced modularity helped, at least compared to the simple neural network. But D is no better than B and C. They should have really labeled these with different colors or shown these lines differently. Whatever, B, C, and D do more or less the same. So it's useful to have hidden neurons, it's useful to have recurrence, it's useful to have modularity, but this human-induced modularity is no better than just throwing in some hidden neurons and recurrent connections. E, which is drawn in bold here, ultimately the other ones catch up, but E makes it possible for evolution to make quick, rapid progress. So the clear winner here are robots that were evolved with cognitive architecture E. And this is the main takeaway message from today's lecture, is that at least in this simple experiment, it was better to let evolution discover and enforce modularity on the brain of the robot than it was to have the investigators enforce modularity on the controller or not enforce modularity at all. This plot down here is kind of interesting. They took the evolved controllers from simulation and dropped it onto the physical Kepler robot, and they wanted to see how well the physical robot did. They counted here the number of successful individuals. So they played back the best controllers from experiments A, B, C, D, and E. These are controllers that allow the robot to do kind of okay or really well at the task. And in this case, they counted the number of successful individuals. So in this case, in the physical case, they put five wooden pegs, not sugar cubes, 5 little wooden pegs. And they counted how many times the robot was able to successfully get all 5 of the pegs out of the arena. They did a bunch of experiments. They didn't say how, for the best controller from the 10 replications, how many? Right, so they played back a bunch of different controllers from each of these 5 experiments, and only one of the evolved controllers from experiment A allowed the physical robot to completely clean its environment, but the physical robot equipped with some of the best E-brains, 7 of those individuals, 7 different E controllers were able to enable the physical robot to completely clean up its environment. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this term here, replication. So we've got 5 different experiments. For each one of these experiments, they ran the evolutionary algorithm once, then they went back and created a different random population of synaptic weights and ran evolution forward again for A brains, and again and again and again. They ran the evolutionary algorithm 10 times for experiment A. They replicated that experiment another 10 times for experiment B, and so on, which gives us a total of 50 different evolutionary runs that they performed. Okay, so that gives us 10 champions. If they run evolution 10 times with experiment A, at the end of each of those runs, they pluck out of the evolved population the set of synaptic weights that enabled the robot to do the best. They take the best evolved brain out of each of those 10 trials, which gives 10 champions for A, 10 champions for B, 10 champions for C, D, and E. And they played back each of those 10 champions on the physical robot. In experiment A, only one of those 10 champions completely cleaned the arena. In experiment B, only 10 of the B champion, or only 2 of the 10 B champions cleaned the arena, and so forth. In experiment E, 7 of the 10 E champions successfully cleaned the arena. So not only did robots equipped with E brains evolve quickly to do well at the task, the physical robot, when armed with those successful brains, do better than the others. So just a different way of measuring how good evolution did at evolving this particular behavior for those 5 different types of cognitive architectures. Okay, So we can now look at these results and go back to some of our questions and we can ask various questions about the results. First question you might ask is there a correspondence between evolved modules and distal behaviors? So we're going to look in a moment at how evolution carved up modules in E. We're going to focus on E brains for a moment. The short answer, as you're going to see, is that there isn't a correspondence. Whatever modularity evolution found here, and evolution did find some modularity because it was useful. We know that it was useful. It doesn't seem to map on what we intuitively might think of as a good way to carve things up into behaviors. For example, module A, explore until an object is found, and then module B, do what you need to do once you've found an object. Okay, so we're going to look to see that the answer is actually no. We can't understand the modularity that evolution discovered. We're going to look at just one evolved controller from the E experiments, a single set of synaptic weights. This particular single set of synaptic weights causes the controller to switch between just two states. What do I mean by that? In this case, evolution only switched the two modules back and forth for the right motor. So there were certain points in time when the robot was controlled by this set of evolved E-weights in which the left output neuron was controlling the right motor, and there were other points in time in which the right output neuron controlled the right motor. So there were two different modules or two different ideas that the robot had about what to do with the right motor, and those different ideas grabbed control of the right motor at different times. In the other three groups, either the left selector neuron was always greater than the right selector neuron, or the right selector neuron always had a greater value than the left selector neuron. Although evolution could have evolved these sets of synaptic weights to switch to allow these two different modules to control the other three things the robot can do, evolution set those synaptic weights to not make use of those additional potential modules. Make sense? So this controller only has two states. Either this idea is controlling the right motor or this idea is controlling the right motor. And whatever it was in the other three, it was either the left output neuron always had control of the left motor or the right output neuron always had control of the left motor. It's not clear in this case. Make sense? Okay, let's keep going. Okay, let's start with observing what the robot actually does when it's equipped with cognitive architecture E and labeled with this particular sets of synaptic weights that allows the robot to successfully clean up the environment. Again, this experiment was conducted in the mid-90s. So no YouTube videos at this point. We're going to have to content ourselves with this figure here. So let me walk you through it. Here's the robot here, and you can see it's two pincers that make up its gripper. So it's pointing to the southeast at this moment in time. This squiggly line is showing you the trajectory that this robot the trajectory of this robot while it was controlled by this controller. At some point, the robot was driving in this direction and grabbed this object. You can see it's white now, indicating that there was an object here, but there was an object here at the beginning of this trial, but not at the end. The robot grabbed this object, came down here, and was facing the wall and presumably dropped this object here, turned around, started heading northwest, came into contact with this object, picked it up, drove over here and dropped it out here. It's a little hard to see but from this trajectory, but was driving around and managed to come into contact with these three objects at various points in time, take them to some edge of the arena and drop it over the arena. It never got to object 4 or 5. Okay. The time that it took for it to do that is plotted on the horizontal axis down here. So this is not evolutionary time. This is plotting the lifetime of this particular robot with this neural controller. We're going to walk down each of these rows in this figure one at a time. Let's start with mod up here. This is which module controls the right motor. Remember that the selector neurons here in the right motor are switching back and forth between which of those two selector neurons has the greater value, causing these different neural modules to grab the right motor. Periods of time in which mod is black, that means that the right side idea is in control of the right motor. Periods of white indicate that the left idea is in control of the right motor. Yeah. So you can see the e-brain switching back and forth between these two ideas. Which of these two ideas is translated by the robot into reality? You'll already notice that the evolved modularity discovered by the evolutionary algorithm looks different from what we might have enforced as modularity, because these two modules are flicking back and forth very rapidly. You would imagine that if one module corresponds to holding the object, there would be one contiguous black band where that module, deal with a held object, takes place, and then you'd expect very long contiguous blocks of white where the robot is looking for an object, for example. So already our intuition is broken here. Let's have a look at some of the other rows here. What exactly is the robot perceiving? So is it seeing a wall? Is it facing a wall, or is it facing a target object? If we look at these black bands where it can see a wall, then it sees a target, then it's a target object, and it sees neither a wall nor a target object, then a target object again, and then it's seeing a wall for quite a long period of time. There's no clear correspondence between the pattern of black and white down here and the pattern of black and white up here. So this WT was the investigator's first guess about what these modules might correspond to. Maybe these modules correspond to whether the robot is looking at a wall or looking at a target object. That's not it. Here's the speed at which the left motor is spinning. You'll notice the left motor is spinning quite a bit, and then it slows down during this period and slows down during this period. There's a little bit of a correspondence between the speed of the left wheel and the pattern of the different modules switching on and off, switching back and forth up here, but again, it's not a perfect correspondence. There is a stronger correspondence between the speed of the right motor and the switching of the modules, which kind of makes sense, because remember that these two modules are switching back and forth, and when one switches on, perhaps it causes the right motor to do something else. You can kind of see that when the black module is in control, the right motor is spinning slower, and when the white module is in control, the wheel is spinning faster. What that means, again, who really knows? Then they looked at periods in which the pickup motor primitive was triggered. Here it's triggered here it's being triggered a little bit, and so on. Again, no real correspondence between when pickup is triggered and either of these two modules. So whatever this module is, it's not control pickup. RL is release. So here's release firing, meaning the robot is holding steady, and then here's a period in which release is inhibited. The robot is not releasing the object. It's a little counterintuitive. So release is do this, and this is periods in which it's not doing that. So you can see that, again, there's a little bit of a correspondence between these white gaps here and these white gaps up here. But again, there's no clear pattern. It's very difficult to understand what these modules are controlling. Here's the pattern of activation of the 6 infrared sensors, or the proximity sensors. Again, we can see there's not much of a correspondence, but there's a little bit. It seems more or less that when the black module is in control, that happens to be when the 6 infrared sensors are stimulated. So maybe there is an intuitive pattern here we could detect, but it's not clear exactly what it is. Okay. Here's the light barrier sensor, that little beam between the two pincers, and we can see that during this period and this period and this period, the beam is broken. These correspond to the 3 periods during the robot's behavior in which it's holding one of these 3 objects that it eventually jettisons out of the arena. Again, no real clear pattern there. Finally, the investigators came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 situations that can occur as the robot is cleaning up the arena. These are periods in which it's carrying an object and seems to be looking for a wall. That's exactly those periods in which those 3 periods in which it's holding an object. Those candidate or hypothetical, behavioral modules don't seem to correspond too well to what's going on up here. Gripper is empty and it's looking for an object, a different candidate behavioral module. If we look at pattern B, these are the periods in which that potential or hypothetical behavioral module might be in control of the robot, and they plot exactly that just by watching the robot. Those hypothetical modules don't seem to correspond to the real modules, and so on. So you can go through the rest of these. The takeaway from this very complicated figure is whatever modules, the way in which evolution has carved up the overall behavior of cleaning up the arena here doesn't seem to map any of the ways we might carve up this task into subtasks. Okay. Here they had a look at, as we've seen several times before, how this robot, how the evolved controllers do when they replay that controller on the robot at novel locations. They put the robot at new positions inside the arena. How well does the evolved behavior generalize to new situations? They looked at a total of 7,200 new situations. They placed the robot near an object or the wall, with the robot at 180 different horizontal angles. So maybe it's near an object and it's facing the object, or it's near an object and facing away from an object, and so on. And they did that at 20 different distances of the robot away from either an object or the wall, and they set it in that situation with either its gripper already gripping an object or not. So it gives a total of 7,200 trials. If you look at just the errors here, these were the number of errors that the robot made. What counts as an error? The error might be the robot is holding an object over the edge of the arena. The right thing to do would be to drop it. An error would be to back up and keep the object in the environment. Or an error might be the robot is close to an object, facing that object, and isn't currently holding an object. The right thing to do would be to go forward and pick that object up. If it doesn't, that counts as an error. So if you just look at these 4 black bars here, you'll see that the B bar and the E bar are lower than the other 2. I have absolutely no idea why they didn't plot this information for C. Maybe this was just an oversight. So E is doing pretty well, and B is also, for some reason, generalizing pretty well as well. And B is the neural network that it contains internal neurons, but no modularity. Okay, these sets of plots over here, we're going to take a few minutes to walk our way through them. These were all generated by a single evolved E-controller, an E-controller that did very well on board the robot during evolution. And during evolution, the robot never made a mistake. Whenever it was near an object and wasn't holding one, it would turn and pick it up. Whenever it was holding an object and it was near a wall, it would drive to that wall and drop it over the edge. They're going to play back the robot using this E-controller a very large number of times again. Actually, these are all 7,200 cases. So every pixel in these upper 4 panels corresponds to one of those 7,200 possible situations. Okay, let's see how to read this. We've got 4 different, we can break those 7,200 situations down into 4 buckets. There's the case where the robot is near a wall and its gripper is empty. There's the case where the robot is near a wall and its gripper is full. There's the case where the robot is near a cylindrical object and its gripper is empty. And a fourth and final situation where the robot is near a cylindrical object, but it's already holding an object. On the horizontal axis here, they're showing the angle of the robot relative to the wall that's nearby, or the robot's relative angle, its relative angle relative to the cylindrical object that's nearby. An angle of 0 means the robot is facing that wall or facing that cylinder head on. A value of 180 means that robot is facing away from the object, near the object or the cylinder. So the wall or cylinder is nearby, but it's directly behind the robot, and everything else in between. So as we march left or right along any of these 4 panels, we're thinking about the robot oriented differently relative to the object that's nearby, a cylinder or the wall. The vertical axis represents how close the robot is to either that wall or that cylinder. So if we think about wall gripper empty, this particular pixel here, the robot is facing the wall head on, and it is very, very close to the wall. Up here, top center, this is the robot facing the wall, but the wall is pretty far away from the front of the robot. Okay, make sense? Okay, so for every single pixel, and you'll have to trust me, there are 7,200 pixels in these 4 panels. They painted the pixel white if, they painted the pixel black if the robot in that situation triggered, or the controller in the robot in that situation triggered the pickup behavior. And you'll notice there is a small patch of black here. So the robot immediately starts to trigger the pickup behavior if the robot is facing a cylinder head on and that cylinder is very close. Makes sense, right? This particular patch, out of all these other patches, this is exactly the conditions under which the robot should attempt to grasp the cylinder. The gray pixels correspond to this the subset of those 7,200 situations in which the robot immediately tried to do the release behavior. That also makes sense. This patch in here corresponds to those situations in which the robot is facing the wall and the wall is nearby. And the gripper is full. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. That also is important. So these are the situations in which it's literally holding the cylindrical object outside the wall and it's facing the wall. White pixels correspond to neither the pickup behavior nor the release behavior being triggered. Okay, so this is a robot that seems to be doing exactly the right thing in all of those 7,200 situations, with maybe the exception of this little patch here. In this case, the robot should be dropping the cylinder and it isn't. So arguably it's not perfect. These 4 panels, exactly the same as these 4 panels up here, but the data in these 4 panels was generated by a different evolved controller, one that also that never made mistakes during evolution, but when exposed to these 7,200 situations, it did make a few mistakes. And I'll give you a moment to look at this data to see if you can spot where the problem is, where it's making mistakes. It's doing the right thing here. It's facing the wall, its gripper is full, and it's dropping the object. It's doing the right thing over here. It's facing a cylindrical object close by and head on, and its gripper is empty. It should indeed try and pick up the object. The error is over here. In this case, the robot is very close to a cylinder. There's a cylinder just front right of it, and it's very close to it, but its gripper is full. What does it do in this case? There's a small patch of gray, meaning it triggers the release behavior. It's already holding an object. There's a second object front right, and it drops the object that it's holding. Not the right thing to do. Okay, I want you to keep your eye on this part of the slide. I'm going to switch back and forth to a different slide now, but I want you to watch this situation. Remember that this patch of pixels corresponds to situations in which the robot is holding an object, there's an object just off just in front and to the right of it, and it's dropping the object. This plot, again, these 4 panels correspond to exactly the same situation. In this case, every black pixel is which of those 7,200 situations that controller encountered during evolution. Every white pixel are situations that e-controller never saw during evolution. As you can see, most of the pixels are white, meaning at least more than 50% of the 7,200 possible situations the robot can encounter. Its e-controller causes it to behave in a way that it doesn't encounter those other situations. This is an important point that we haven't brought up before, is that one of the things that a neural controller for a robot does, or a biological brain does for an organism, is keep that robot or that organism out of all possible situations. So you'll notice if we go back to looking at this particular patch here, the place where we forced that robot or we forced that controller into these situations down here, that controller never allowed the robot to see those situations during evolution. Makes sense, right? It's never seen these situations before, so there's no guarantee that it's going to do the right thing after evolution when we deploy it out in the real world, and it's going to experience a wider range of situations than it ever saw during evolution. Okay, so to summarize this experiment, the experiment was a success in the sense that they were able to evolve a neural controller that found a way to modularize the brain of the robot, and they were able to find that neural modularity in that case is actually useful. So what the evolutionary algorithm determined, or what it sort of coded into the brain of the robot, were actually 4 different things. First of all, the evolved controllers determined which sensor states would be experienced by the robot while moving, and that's the figure that we just saw. This particular evolved controller only allows the robot to see these situations. A different evolved controller allows the same robot to see or experience a different subset of all possible experiences. Evolution determined whether a behavior should be divided into modules or not. If evolution had tuned the synaptic weights here so that the selector neurons never changed their relative magnitudes, it would basically be evolution saying, I know you've allowed me to to evolve and then switch between modules. I don't need the modules. I'm just going to stick with a certain set of connections from sensors to motors. Evolution also determined, so evolution did break these up into modules by evolving the synaptic weights that go from the sensor neurons to the black selector neurons. What exactly the motor neuron was forced to do when those different modules were in charge was set by the evolved weights of the synapses that flow from the sensor neurons to the white output neurons. So evolution found modules and then figured out what the robot should be doing differently in those different modules. What situation should trigger those modules and what each module should do, how it should control the robot's behavior. So what experiences evolution determines what experiences the robot should have, whether it should have a modular brain, and it should. What situations, what environmental situations trigger which modules are in charge at any given time. And then finally, what those modules do when they control the robot. Okay, that concludes our discussion of modularity as it relates to robotics. Next time, we'll move on to a different open challenge in robotics, which also has to do with the neural controllers for our robots. And we'll see a very famous solution to that problem, but maybe not the final solution to this problem. Until then, thank you.